Hola, ¿qué tal? Hello there. I'm Robert Martinez, State Historian of New Mexico, and this is New Mexico History in 10 minutes. In the aftermath of the U.S. Civil War, there were many lives that had been destroyed, and many of the men who fought in those wars needed to start a new life. Some from the North went south. They wanted the spoils of war to get wealthy on the wreckage of the South. And many started to look west as a place of opportunity to start a new life and to get wealthy in places like Texas, uh, California, Colorado, Arizona, and New Mexico. Two such men were Stephen Elkins and Thomas Catron, and they were lawyers, attorneys who were versed in U.S. law. Well, they saw in New Mexico a real opportunity in land, but also cattle, railroads, business, and exploiting local populations for their gain, their wealth. This was the Gilded Age. Mark Twain had summed it up by writing something like, this is a time to get wealthy, and if you need to get wealthy, do it dishonestly. But if you have to, do it honestly. This attitude was brought to New Mexico by people like Elkins and Catron. And what they wanted to do was start a system where they could use the local political machinery to build their wealth and their power. So this started a movement of political and economic corruption in New Mexico's state government. This was the territorial period in the 1870s and 1880s. Now, they weren't the only ones who were doing this. There were many land speculators, attorneys, businessmen, politicians who were coming from back east to New Mexico to start a new life and to build uh, estates for themselves. So, what you start to see happening is this exploitation of land grants that had been established and given in the Spanish period and then in the Mexican period. So, one of the main land grants that is the center of this movement is the Maxwell Land Grant. It's a huge land grant that, after some political corruption and political favors that are being done for people like Catron and Elkins, starts to establish a huge amassing of land that stretched from southern New Mexico all the way up into what is now Colorado. This group of men, who are mainly white Anglos from back east, but also included a few local Hispano businessmen and merchants, comes to be known as the Santa Fe Ring. The Santa Fe Ring is a system of politicians and businessmen and farmers, ranchers who look at the railroad, at ranching, cattle, and land as a way of acquiring power. And it's done at the expense of the poorer people of New Mexico, the Hispanos, and the Native American people. Contracts are handed out in a very unethical way to certain businessmen to provide beef and vegetables for Apache, Native Americans, and other Native groups. And sometimes these goods were not delivered, or what was delivered was rotten and inedible. So these are examples of some of the things that were going on. Also, the acquiring of Hispano land grants through legal maneuvers that were quite different from what the local population were accustomed to under Spanish law and then Mexican law. So this leads to major acquisitions of land and wealth in a small group of people's hands, and a lot of stress and tension in local communities. Now, we need to understand that not everyone was on board. There would be tensions, especially in places like Colfax County and Lincoln County. For example, let's look at Lincoln County, where there will be eventually the Lincoln County War that will figure in New Mexico lore and history for decades to come, even centuries. This comes about because of a monopoly established by some of the businessmen who did dealings with the Santa Fe Ring, two Irish immigrants by the names of Lawrence Murphy and James Dolan. They establish a monopoly of land and goods in Lincoln County. And this system that they have in place is challenged by a British immigrant by the name of John Tunstall. This is a classic Irish versus British conflict played out on New Mexico soil. Ultimately, this leads first to tensions between these two factions, but by 1878, some very unsavory characters in the form of gangs start to be involved, and Tunstall is assassinated. He's assassinated in 1878, and he has his own group of gunmen who fight on his side. They're called the Lincoln County Regulators, and one of them is a guy by the name of William Bonney, also known as Billy the Kid. So this is one of the situations that really brings into focus the conflict, not just between Hispanos and white Anglo settlers in New Mexico, but even between settlers from back east vying for political and economic authority. Now, this Santa Fe Ring, which has infiltrated the Republican Party in New Mexico and the state government, is very powerful, and its influence extends throughout the state. One of the things that ultimately will happen is that the Santa Fe Ring will be challenged by other settlers from back east, but also local Hispanos and other groups who want to challenge this corruption. Now, let's take a moment to think about this. Some of the dysfunction that we see in New Mexico state government in the 20th century can be traced back, well, first to Spanish times, when you had governors appointed by the viceroy in Mexico City. And usually these were men from Spain. And it was almost part of the system that they had to come here and build their wealth on the back. They had to come here and build their wealth on the backs of this system of Spanish governors appointed by the viceroy in Mexico City included an aspect of building their wealth on the backs of local native peoples and mixed blood Hispano settlers. And there was corruption involved in that system, favors, who you knew, politicians, both local and from the outside. So there's that aspect of Spanish local government in New Mexico that endures. And then it continues to a certain extent into the Mexican period, where military men were assigned to New Mexico to impose taxes and to also acquire wealth locally. But we also have to look at this system of corruption brought by the Americans, because it's not just Catherine and Elkins that are doing this all on their own. They're very aware of local law and how to manipulate the local legal system to their advantage to acquire land, especially the common lands that were very much a part of Spanish and Mexican land grants, but were not part of British or American land law. So they took these lands legally and illegally, and established a system that in a way is still with us. We're still having debates and legal wranglings over land grants stretching back centuries. And this system established by the Santa Fe Ring, the system of corruption, is part of the problem, and it's still with us today. So the Spanish, Mexican, and U.S. systems contributed to these corrupt activities by the Santa Fe Ring. The national government had a role to play in it as well, because you had the federal government involved in these legal systems that the Santa Fe Ring members were exploiting and utilizing. The Santa Fe Ring by the 1890s starts to fall apart. Their influence wanes. We'll see later on, I'll talk about the Lincoln County War, and we'll see what happens there and what happens with this guy named Billy the Kid. That's his nickname. But for now, I just want to end this episode with the idea that the Santa Fe Ring ultimately is no longer in existence, but its influence will continue for another 100 years. Thank you. See you next time. Adios. Goodbye.